Welcome to the From Guilt to Good podcast, where we discuss all the things caregivers wish people would talk about, but don't, won't, or can't. Hi, my name is Jeanette Yates, founder of The Self Caregiver. I cared for my own mother for several decades and now help caregivers set boundaries and use simple tools that make care and life easier so they can feel good, not guilty. In this week's episode of From Guilt to Good, we are joined by Billy Miranda, a licensed therapist, counselor, education, and supervision doctoral student. He's a caregiver with both lived and professional experience supporting family members with serious mental health conditions and dementia. Drawing from his personal caregiving journey and his work as a clinician, educator, and supervisor in training, Billy focuses on the emotional realities of caregiving, caregiver stress, and resilience. His doctoral research explores how emerging technologies, particularly artificial intelligence, can be thoughtfully and ethically integrated to support caregivers' mental health and well-being. Billy is passionate about amplifying caregiver voices, reducing burnout, and bridging research, technology, and human connection. Welcome to the podcast, Billy. It is so nice to welcome you on the podcast after meeting on TikTok, where I find some of my favorite caregiver friends.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Jeanette.
All right. So, like I just mentioned, I reached out to you after I posted something on TikTok about what I had noticed was an uptick in a lot of caregiver tech, or tech that is geared towards caregivers or aging people. And while I'm very excited, I love tech. I've worked in tech. I use tech every day. I also am a little wary of the increase in the technology, and I'm just concerned about some of the privacy issues that are unique to the healthcare and caregiver space. And so I posted something, you responded back that you were doing some doctoral work, and we connected and started chatting about that. And so I wanted to go deeper into that conversation with you today. But first, the first thing I always do with all of my guests is to ask about their own personal caregiving journey. So I would love for you to share what you feel comfortable with in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. So I became an informal caregiver for my mother about 4 years ago. She has Alzheimer's disease, dementia. So, it's this progressive illness that unfortunately has, gradually made things a little harder on herself. And of course, by proxy, me as her caregiver makes things a little more difficult. And so, interestingly enough, this is what inspired me to pursue this in my educational pursuits, where I've already had a history in my own education also in dealing with stress or studying stress. So in my first master's, I actually studied post-traumatic stress specifically and work with clients who deal with trauma and different types of stress as well, just acute stress. And stress can come in a lot of different ways, right? And stress is essentially when we feel that we don't really have the resources given what it is that we're dealing with. So when we get that sense, then that's when stress starts really popping up. And when it gets really extreme, it can seem like a traumatic, or it can be a potentially traumatic experience. So when I myself got into this caregiver role, I was really self-reflective on, what it is that I'm going through through this with my own personal knowledge from my research as a grad or as my master's student. I'm a PhD student, so a different type of grad student, I guess. So when I was doing research then, what I learned about stress and how to take care of yourself for me was always about like self-care. And I always tried to maintain that and still do, but it's always been really in the forefront of my mind. So especially now as my mom, her disease starts to progress, I have to be even more mindful of that. And I found that in my time of caring for her, personally, I've started using things like AI,
Right.
chatbots to kind of just figure things out. Uh,
Right.
One thing about being an informal caregiver is that, and I know you're very familiar with, is that we are often just kind of thrown into this position, and there's not really a lot of knowledge that we have or we think we have. I remember learning about Alzheimer's disease when I was early in my college years, like way back in the day, and had this general idea that it's, memory
Right.
loss and things like that, but I really had no idea what was really involved. And then, boy, did I learn.
Yeah.
And so those are the questions that I asked these chatbots. I'm like, I need answers. Like, it's 2 in the morning. This is what I'm dealing with. Please help me. And so I found that for me, it became a really useful tool.
Hmm.
And so, me also being a doc student, I'm like, let's start exploring this a little deeper with other caregivers and see what's going on.
Yeah, it is something that, I've worked in the social media space for years. I mean, kind of like since it became a thing. So I remember having similar conversations about like, is social media good or bad, right? And it's like, well, it's neither. It's a tool that can be used for good or bad. And I think a similar conversation can be had with AI. I will say one thing about AI that is different as a technology is that its adoption rate and evolution and the innovation is happening so quickly, and it's permeating everywhere. I think faster than when we saw the social media platforms popping up, and so it's a little bit harder to stay up to speed with what is going on. And then, of course, now they overlap, right? Because every social media tool is using some form of AI in different ways, either behind the scenes or, on the platform, customer facing. So it is something that's hard. But like you, I think we're all as caregivers like, I don't I know I need to research this thing, or I know I need to find a solution for this problem, but I don't have time to do, it's at 2 o'clock in the morning. I can't call the doctor and ask them a question, or I can't call my friend that's a nurse, or I can't, whatever. And I just want to answer. And whether I realize it or not, this is another thing that's interesting is some people don't realize that when they go to Google and they ask Google a question, if they did that a few years ago, Google is providing them with articles. What is the word? Forums. I can't think of the word. Forums and all that, where people have had these conversations for years and years and years. Now, when they go to Google and they type in a question, the first thing that's going to come up are AI, their version of ChatGPT, the Gemini tool. And so that's going to be what shows up for them. Or so some people don't even realize that that is AI, right? In the same way that if they use ChatGPT, they're not paying that much attention. Again, like you said, it's the middle of the night, they're just Googling. Or they're going to ChatGPT on purpose because it's helped them with so many other things. It's fun. Maybe they've, used it for fun things, or maybe they're, they use it for work, or they've used it, their kids have shown them something. And so they get like, oh yeah, this is really easy. I love that I can just ask it a question. I don't have to be like, it's more conversational. And so it does provide that like, oh, gosh, this isn't easy. And it's so helpful. The way it talks back to you is so nice. It's
Yeah,
helpful.
it's become a lot more personalized, right? Where we see that, like when it first came out, I think it's like over a decade ago right now when it first actually came out, compared to like how things are now. Um, like it's become a lot more like personable, like, oh yeah. And you can actually train it to, it's machine learning, right? It's the way in which it works, is the input that you give it, as well as, everything else that is pre-programmed into it. Like if you go to ChatGPT or Gemini or, any of these other chatbots and you say, hey, can you talk to me like you're my therapist for a minute? It will. I've
It will.
actually tried that, just to see like, how effective is this as a tool? And me being a therapist, I'm like, wow, this is really good.
Well, and so that brings up one of the points that you and I talked about when we had our pre-recording conversation, where it will do what you ask it to do. And it will try very hard to give you the answers that you are seeking. But sometimes that comes with there might not always be just positives to that. And so now you bring up a big case, which is people use ChatGPT and other models to, almost as a therapist. And again, no shade to anybody doing that, because it's hard to get to therapy. Even when you're not stressed out and burned out and all these things, it's hard to pay for therapy. It's hard to do all these things. And so if you can have somebody that kind of can act as a therapist, which you can tell it to do, and it goes and finds information perhaps written by therapists, or can it access therapy textbooks and all this kind of stuff. It can give you this feeling of like, oh yeah, this is, and like you said, you're like, oh yeah, this is like therapy and I'm a therapist.
Yeah.
But talk to me a little bit about what are some things we need to be on the lookout when we use chat gpt as a therapist or a doctor.
So this is actually something that's being explored right now. Actually, the methodologist for my dissertation committee, he's working on this closely with the NBCC, the National Board of Certified Counselors, to actually answer that question, like where are we with AI and how are actual counselors or therapists using it? Because even in like our notes, like when we take notes, like the note taking or like the PHI or public health information, like the formatting that we use to take notes, excuse me, they are like there's a little AI button that you can hit that'll actually assist you with the notes that you're taking. And so all of this kind of brings out like, okay, where are we with this? And is all of this stuff HIPAA compliant? Is it encrypted? The software that we use, it is, but it kind of begs a larger question of, for us as therapists, like what are the limitations that are put in place? Right now, there's none. Right now, we're in this wild west of AI, where
Right.
there's like almost no regulations, which makes it scary because especially working from as a healthcare professional for mental health, we have to abide by HIPAA laws. We have to abide by privacy, and confidentiality is, what we that's one of the powers of therapy. What we say in therapy, what is said in therapy, it's a confidential conversation with a few exceptions. And usually those are like really extreme matters. So it's really important to have these conversations now. And we're kind of in the dark and we're still trying to figure things out. And what you mentioned before is that things are progressing so fast. It's like we're trying to keep up.
Yeah, I'm gonna drop this in feeds in 5 days. It might have changed whatever we're
Right?
saying. Well, so you bring up a good point, and I do want to circle back on this and just really make sure that I heard you correctly and make sure that other people, that we're all on the same page about this. So I can talk to you, Billy, my therapist. Let's say he's not really my therapist, but let's just say he was. Billy, you're my therapist. I come into your office, I talk to you, or we have a Zoom call, I talk to you, not on a Zoom call because we're having it probably on a closed. I know when I see my therapist online, it's like we're not just on Zoom, we're like on some kind of secure
But you can actually have Zoom because Zoom does offer HIPAA
HIPAA does.
encoded. So just as a side note.
No, but that's my point. So, like, when I'm in your office or whether I'm seeing you on some sort of secure platform, that is HIPAA compliant. And then you take notes with you take notes and then maybe you enter them into, to digitize them. There's an AI tool there, but that AI tool is also, and where the notes are stored is also HIPAA compliant. There's a bunch of HIPAA. You
Yes.
can't go chit chat out there. The tool that you're using is HIPAA compliant. The platform we're using to communicate, HIPAA compliant. When I go to ChatGPT and say, act as my therapist, is that HIPAA compliant?
No,
No.
it's not.
And why is that important for people to understand? So we're using that because you're a therapist, we're talking about therapy, but this is the same thing. If you're going to HIPAA and asking it medical questions, if you're and saying, act as my neurologist,
Hmm.
or act as a neurologist that specializes in, you know, Alzheimer's, even if you're doing all that, it's not HIPAA compliant.
No, it's not. And it can be dangerous, right? And that's, of course, what we need to explore. HIPAA's there for a reason, right? We have our HIPAA in place to protect the privacy of the patients. So anytime that becomes compromised, like if you're putting in like healthcare information into like ChatGPT, then if it's not HIPAA compliant, like there are no boundaries set in place to prevent that from being shared, that information. So if I were to say like, okay, ChatGPT, act like my therapist, and I'm I use it just to see what it's capable of. I wasn't actually using it as my therapist. But if I did, and I were to say everything that's going on with me,
Right. There it is.
There it is. Exactly. Again, we're in this wild west of AI. So really, is my information safe? I'm talking about all my deepest, darkest secrets as might happen in therapy oftentimes. And now this is somewhere floating around in AI world. How comfortable do I feel about that? Personally, I wouldn't feel too comfortable about that. And so this is again why these conversations need to be had, why some sort of moderations need to be made.
I
Just check
think at
your
the very least, what I hope to do with my platform and the conversations I have with people like you and care tech companies and people that are working in this space is education. Because once you know that, you can make a decision like, oh, well, that's good to know. I'm going to do it anyway because this is all I got, or what your decision to, I mean, that's your decision to make. But I think us people not being aware of that and not understanding how the tool works, that is even more dangerous. I think, I haven't read Gemini's terms of service yet, but I did read Chat GPT's. And if you read them, they're clear that there are some measures you can take, like there's a thing you can toggle that says don't use my data for training mode, which means when they're training new people or training the learning model, they won't use your stuff. But if you don't do that, again,
hmm
it could be used. But then also it says like we make every effort to keep things private and say, but nothing nothing
What
certain.
wind, right? We make every effort, but what's legally binding,
Right,
right?
right. And then, they also talk about like this is not, sometimes AI makes mistakes, which I think I don't know if you are watching season 2 of The Pit, but they're you know, every week is a an hour in the ER shift, right? And week 1 and 2, I can't remember if it was week 1 or week 2, but there's this conversation about doctors using AI tools, and of course, one makes a mistake, right? But there is that point where that you were talking about earlier where there's AI note takers, but you still need to like double check and make sure that what it has summarized for you or how it has worded something is
Accurate.
actually what you meant it to say, right? And so there's just the fact that AI can make mistakes, I think is another thing that I take for granted. No, like that I know that. I just assume that everybody else does, but they don't. And I think it's something that is is important for us to make sure people understand that this is a model, that's learning all the time, and you can ask it something today, you can ask it something the same thing in 3 weeks, it may give you a different answer, it may give you the same answer, it may give you a different answer. Which one is the right answer? Like it's something to be aware of as you're using these tools. But I think there are a lot of great ways that caregivers can use these tools. But before I get there, I do want to talk to you about that. But before I get there, we talked about consent a little bit in our pre-conversation, and how a lot of times what we're sharing with a tool may not be our own information, but it might be someone else's. And so, have you had any of those conversations in your doctoral work about like that ethical consent side of using some of these tools?
So specifically in that regard, so much consent is one of the first things that we do. Informed consent, right? As therapists, right? So we always let our clients know, like what it is that we do. We let them know our credentials. We let them know what it is that we do, what therapy is kind of all about. We also let them know about confidentiality and, more importantly, the limits of confidentiality. Right? We always have to let them know, like first and foremost, like okay, what we say between us is, between us. But if there's any suspicion of abuse or neglect of a child or an elderly, so those are things where we're mandated reporters. So we let them know from the get go, so that way they're informed, and then they can say, okay, yeah, I'm good, and then move forward. So that way, down the road, there's no surprises if abuse or neglect does come up down the road. So, okay, well, I have to make a call.
Well, and I know that my doctors also inform me So they do that stuff. But then they also inform me when they're using an AI tool with my information. So I have one doctor that uses an AI tool um, to that's just recording our whole entire visit, and then it summarizes. And every time I see him, even if I see him 2 or 3 days in a row, he says, you know, blah blah blah. He says what the tool is, he says how it works, he asks me if he has permission to use it, and then he activates it.
See, I
And
love
yeah, I know, I think it's so great because that
responsible.
also, yeah,
That's
it
very
helps.
responsible.
Go ahead, what were you saying? Yes. And it gives me the opportunity to ask any questions I have about the tool he's using. A lot of times, like I think it's interesting because, there's a lot of things that doctors use that we don't say, how do you, what does that do and how does that work? We're just like, sure, it's a tool that you need to help me just use it. and but and they don't necessarily, well, I will say, I was going to say they don't necessarily ask permission, but they kind of do. I think now that I think about it, even when they're doing a physical
Because you can always
examination,
decline.
yeah, they
You can
typically
always
say,
decline services, yeah.
yeah, we're going to do this now. We're going to do this now.
Mhm.
So I guess that's just an extension of that, which is really great. Yeah. So I think, I don't know the answer to that either. I know a lot of us have power of attorney where we are able to step in and, you know, interact on behalf of somebody. So that may play into the consent piece of talking, through AI about something or talking through something with AI. But like I said, I think they're like, it is the wild, wild west. We want to be able to use it and feel confident using AI tools that we choose to use, but also be aware of some of the wild west nature of how things are right now and continue to educate ourselves. And that's what I hope to do with, my content and having people on the podcast to talk about that. But let's get to the fun stuff. Let's get to some of the ways that some of the things that we're excited about in caregiver technology and what our hope is for caregivers using AI technology. So give me some things that you've seen that you're excited about, or maybe that you're excited about that you see hopefully coming down the pipe.
Yeah, so one of the big ones that through the research that I was going through is using AI, like chatbots, things like that, um, is not as a replacement, but as a supplement to therapy or support groups. Because I mean, there is the research that's out there right now. It does support the idea that it can help with mental health symptoms. It can help. Uh, there's actually one article on a specific chatbot called Replica. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that one, but it's a really interesting one because it's a chatbot, but it also kind of comes with this avatar where you can like create this avatar. It's not like super customizable or anything at this point, but you can say, I want it to be, an elderly, astute looking male or whatever. So and then that can be your mentor, and then you can have these conversations with this avatar, through a chatbot where you almost like kind of seeing like a face. And that one has features where you can pay, get some like extra features, of course, kind of like ChatGPT and other ones. But the interesting one about this is the study that was done on, I mean, it was actually a pretty large sample. Like I think it was about 1,000, where the people who used it, they were college students, so they're a bit younger, more tech savvy probably, and a lot of them did report that it helped with their mental health, right? So that was pretty much a large consensus there. But there was a small group in there who actually experienced suicidality.
Mm,
Was pretty mind blowing, but the more mind-blowing part of that was they actually got talked out of their ideation, their suicidal ideation, through the chatbot,
right.
and they reported that in the study, which came as a surprise to the researchers. They didn't think it would be like that impactful, but it was for some of the participants. So it showed a lot of promise of how it can be used to help people with mental health symptoms, even people who are experiencing really severe mental health symptoms. So and again, we're like kind of like in this infancy of where we're at with our AI capabilities and imagine where things are going to go in another 10 years. And I think that's what is exciting about it, is that there's so much potential that if things go in the right direction, and you can decide whether it's right or not, right?
Right.
Then it can be really a form of support for not, again, not a replacement, but a form of support for caregivers. And so it's one really big caveat there is the big thing that's lacking at this point, specifically for caregivers and how AI can be used to support caregivers, specifically informal caregivers, is none of the none of the designers are looking at informal caregivers as stakeholders
Right.
for consulting for their AI. So there's never, at this point, there's not going to be like anything that's really specifically tailored for informal caregivers. But I think that there is certainly potential, and if informal caregivers do get put into the mix of this, then it can be even more helpful down the road. So it's certainly promising.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned the mental health piece, especially because that is something, of course, all caregivers pretty much deal with to some degree, you know. And I especially am thankful that you mentioned both the pros and cons, or the some of the concerns that people have now, because I have just in the last 5 weeks started talking about AI and caregiving more, and the use of technology. And I've already gotten some pushback about some of the negative stories out there about AI's impact on people's mental health, especially young people, but also potentially vulnerable people like caregivers up at 3 o'clock in the morning, that are stressed out. And so I think it's very important, one, that you were talking about a specific tool, not just random, a random chatbot, but something that it sounds like it was specifically designed for mental health.
I don't know if it was specifically designed for mental health, but in that study, they used that specific.
Right. Okay. So it's just another learning language. But I think that would be a significant thing, that like what might be the best is to have a tool that's trained on mental health theory and education and therapy modalities versus a generalized AI tool that doesn't have that clarification. Then of course, I think another important thing that you mentioned was that to use as support or supplementing, not replacing. And I have several friends that do that, where sometimes they will go to ChatGPT or Gemini and ask, like, I need to talk to my therapist about this, but I don't even know like where to start. And you can kind of like say it all messy and yucky, and then it can give it back to you in like talking points.
Mm-hmm.
So that's very helpful. And so I think that is really exciting. What are, besides trying out the therapy aspect of the chat GPT, for example, what are some ways that you've used, if you're able to share, like chat GPT for your caregiving role, your informal caregiving role?
So the last time I used it where it was really impactful for me was I looked up symptoms. Well, I should say it was impactful for my mom. And this goes again into that, is this kind of teetering against like maybe HIPAA things? Because I did mention a symptom that my mom was having.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I said, okay, this person has, diabetes, high cholesterol. So I was like naming certain things, but I was sure to use language that didn't like specify her per se, right? Just to kind of see what's going on. So my mom has had swelling in the past in her legs because of, water retention and, her being diabetic. And anyway, so I noticed that she only had swelling in one leg. And I'm like, huh, that's weird. I never saw that before. So, I laid all the things out. That's what's going on. So there's somebody here that has, these issues. They've had swelling before, but now only one leg is swelling. What could it be?
Right.
And so it gave like all of these potentials, right? And it's like, back in the day, and maybe people still do it, like the WebMD thing. You go on WebMD and like, oh, I just came out with cancer. Here you go.
Right.
So like, I'm always like kind of apprehensive at looking at this stuff. But when I was going through it, I was kind of using a process of elimination based on the answers that it gave me. But the red flag there was that it could potentially be a blood clot. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to take her to the ER just to be safe, right? It's better safe than sorry at the end of the day. And so, because that was a potential, I was like, all right, I brought her that. And guess what? They found a blood clot. She stayed in the hospital for a few days. They found not just in her leg, but they also found some in her lungs. So she had pulmonary embolism. So she got taken care of. They did a mechanical thrombectomy on her leg. And after a few days, she was okay. Swelling went away. Now she's okay. Now, in that instance, it was really helpful. Now, here's the scary part, and something I thought about afterwards was, what if they didn't tell me that? And what if I was like, yeah, whatevs.
Well, I was going to ask if you didn't do that. So this was my question. If there wasn't that tool, right? If there wasn't ChatGPT to tell you that, would you have probably, like in my head, I was thinking, gosh, like I probably just took my mom to the hospital. Like I did take her 35 times in 5 years. So like we went a lot. But like I'm wondering, which may not be a good thing. Like, if you're taking her every single time, you're not sure what's happening. That's not always a good thing either, right? But yeah, yeah, that is an interesting kind of counter.
Yeah, and it's valid, right? Because at the end of the day, we still have to make a decision.
Right.
And would I have not taken her to the hospital if I didn't go to that because she's had a past
Right.
of having leg swelling? I mean, I can't say for sure. I think, like, I tell myself at least, and I can be an anxious person, and I probably would have been like up all night, like, I hope she's okay, to the point where I was like, okay, if I still found that it was swelling after, her leg's been elevated and um, that, okay, maybe we should still check this out. You know, that wasn't the reality. I ended up going down another route and I ended up taking her there. But, you always kind of question these things. So using it as a supplement can be really good. But we also have to think about the possible dangers when we use it in such a way when it comes to like health. It's not like, okay, I have these ideas. Can you like organize this for me? Or
Right.
can, I mean, it's honestly really cool for like other things. Like you can say like, okay, this is what I have in my refrigerator right now. Can
Right.
you give me a recipe of something that I can make? It will literally give you stuff.
Yeah.
And so
I've actually heard a lot of caregivers say that that's one of the main ways they use it is like to find the appropriate diet, like types of food to feed their loved one that has,
some
diabetes or
diabetes.
cholesterol issues or
Yeah.
can't chew well or, whatever, like very simple things like that. I know also people using it for schedule sorting. Like these are all the things I have to do this week. Can you give me a schedule in which to do them? These are the things that have to happen on certain days. Everything else can happen whenever.
Yeah. And, a lot of us utilize like Siri
Mhm.
or, those conversational agents or Alexa that we talk to. And when we use those, keep in mind that's AI also, right?
Yes. Very
In
good point.
fact, you talked about Gemini, and if I remember correctly, Apple just won that bid, or
Yep.
Gemini won the bid for
Yes.
Apple. So when we use Siri, it's going to be using Gemini. So that's something to think about as well. We're like, oh yeah, well, I'm just using Siri, right? But you're actually using AI, like you said, like you might not even necessarily know it,
Well, and especially if you've been using something like that for so long, you don't even think about it, right?
right?
The same way. But it is worth, educating ourselves a little bit more. I hope to help people do that here. I would love to have you on again to talk more about AI as you learn more through your doctoral work and just, in general, playing with all the tools. That's what I do. If I see a new tool, I'm going to get it and check it out because I do think there's a lot of potential there and there's a lot of support to be had for caregivers and people who are aging. So there's some tools are out there that aren't geared towards a caregiver. They're geared towards the aging person. I think that's great too, but the same applies, right? Like we've got to make sure that we're understanding what we're using it for, how we're using it, and that we've set up it, at the bare minimum, make sure your settings are the way you want them, right? Like,
Yeah.
bare
Yeah.
minimum, let's do that. And then also coming up with fun ways to use it and helpful ways that will make a difference and help us have more time, more energy, more confidence, more clarity, a little bit more breathing room.
Yeah. And you're talking about having more fun with it, like on a lighter note, like you can literally use it to like banter with, like,
Yeah.
hey, like tell me some jokes, like just like lighten the mood, or this is what's going
If
on.
I'm trying to come up with like a witty, like a little, if I'm like texting or talking to a friend of mine and I'm like, we need to come up with a fun name for this, or I'll go and just say like, ChatGPT, give me 10 names for, I don't know, something. And it'll spit out. And most of them are, and sometimes I'll go, that's too cheesy. I need a little bit more
Mhm.
sarcastic. And so yeah, it can be fun. So feel free to, if you're tired of scrolling on TikTok or Instagram and you want to just have a little bit of fun, go ask it for some silly, cheesy jokes and it'll give you a ton.
Or what you can do if you want to be really like, I don't
Let's
know,
nerd out. Let's do it.
mischievous. I'll put um, AIs against one another. Essentially,
Ooh,
where I'll have a conversation between, say, like Gemini and ChatGPT, and like, okay, so Gemini is Billy,
yeah.
ChatGPT is Jeanette. So like, okay, Billy said this. What's your response? And so I'll put their response in and just kind of see where it goes
You're gonna like, but actually,
until it just explodes or something. Like I don't know.
that's so fun. That'll be an interesting. I wonder if they'll do that at some point where they have like, like they've had like the different you know, like the Coke versus Pepsi thing and be like, let's get these two, you
Who
know.
wins the debate, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. Well, Billy, this has been a great conversation and I feel like it's just beginning. I look forward to hearing how your doctoral work goes and I'm very thankful and thank you for joining me today on the podcast. Is there anything else you'd like to tell our audience before we sign off?
Well, I would say for any of you caregivers out there who probably most of your audience are caregivers, I would think informal caregivers. Just, yeah, always take care of yourself. Try not to forget that. I know it's really hard. Like it's literally in our job description to think of your loved one first and foremost, but it's really important also to think of ourselves. And sometimes we just have to sometimes think of creative ways to do that. And honestly, that's kind of why I went towards AI, because what am I going to do at 3 in the morning, you know, besides doom scrolling? Like, well, maybe there's something that might actually be able to help me out a little bit. So again, sometimes we have to be creative, but you just always think about yourself as well.
And I also forgot to mention, but this is really important. If you haven't already, if you don't already follow Billy on TikTok, he is over there at the Carers Corner. Is that
Hmm.
right? Carers
Yep.
Corner. I'll put that in the show notes so that you can get in touch with him. He shares his journey and insights that he has about caregiving. It's wonderful. That's how I met him. And that's how I'm meeting a lot of my podcast friends these days over there. We have a great caregiver community over on TikTok. So come on over and hang out with us. But thank you for joining me. And thank you all for joining me today on the From Guilt to Good podcast. To access additional caregiver resources, get in touch with us on TikTok, support our show, and connect with us on social. Check out the show notes. We're changing the conversation around caregiving one episode at a time. See you soon.